Good evening and welcome to March meeting, or good morning in the case of some. Welcome to March meeting 2021. I am John Tain, Head of Research at Asia Art Archive, and we are now at the second panel for Sharjah Biennials in a regional context. The aim of which is to continue the discussion on the Sharjah Biennial within the context of biennials in the Middle East and South and Southeast Asia, or within the post-colonial constellation that are the biennials of the South, to use Geeta Kapoor's memorable phrase from yesterday's panel on art and civic imagination. Whereas we have just heard from curators about the firsthand experience with the Sharjah Biennial, Thailand Biennial, the Kochi Biennial, the Kochi Biennale rather, the Marrakesh Biennale, and the Jogja Biennale, in the time ahead, we will be hearing about 3 examples of biennials that situate the Sharjah Biennial within an Arabic and South Asian perspective, but also from a number of different standpoints, as scholar and researcher, as curator or commissaire, as biennial director. First, we will hear from Nada Shabout about the Arab Biennale, which ran from 1974 to 1978 in Baghdad, Rabat, and finally in Tripoli. Next, Ayab El-Laban will speak to us about the Cairo Biennale, which began in 1984, and especially his experience with the last 3 editions. And last but not least, Kudzya Rahim will present the Lahore Biennale, one of the youngest biennials in this mix. After the presentations, we will have a discussion before opening it out to questions from the audience. So please feel free to type in your questions via chat at any point, and we will do our best to address them. And I do want to make one point, which is that if you, one of our speakers, I have El-Laban, will be speaking in Arabic. And so if you require interpretation, you should switch over to the Zoom platform rather than sticking with the Inventive platform. And send a chat if you have questions. I'm sure someone can answer the questions. So as to give the most time possible for the panelists and for your questions, please allow me to introduce the speakers without further delay. Nada Shabout teaches art history at the University of North Texas and is the coordinator of the Contemporary Arab and Muslim Cultural Studies Initiative. Her research and teaching address contemporary visual practices and problems of representation from a global perspective, with emphasis or questions on methodology and in relation to the cultural politics of the Middle East. She has curated Sajid, A Century of Modern Art Interventions, a dialogue between the modern and the contemporary, 2010, and the traveling exhibition Dafatir, Contemporary Iraqi Book Art, 2005 to 2009, and co-curated Modernism in Iraq at the Wallach Art Gallery at Columbia University in 2009 as well. Shabout has published numerous articles on modern and contemporary Arab and Iraqi art and is the author of Modern Arab Art, Formations of Arab Aesthetics, co-editor with Salwa Mikdadi of New Vision Arab Art in the 21st Century, and co-editor with Anka Lenson and Sarah Rogers of Modern Art in the Arab World, Primary Documents, Museum of Modern Art, which I have right here. A plug. She has received several awards and grants, including Writers Grant, Andy Warhol Foundation, 2018, the Presidential Excellency Award, UNT, 2018, the American Academic Research Institute in Iraq Fellow, 2006 and 2007, MIT Visiting Assistant Professor, 2008, and Fulbright Senior Scholar Program, Lecture Research Fellowship to Jordan, 2008. Our second speaker, El-Laban, is a curator, cultural operator, and sculptor whose creative practice includes contemporary sculpture, often conceptualized for public open space commissions. He is director of the art center Aisha Fahmy Palace, Egypt. He has previously served as director of Ufuk Gallery, Egypt, where he organized several international exhibitions, including Shamamados in 2007, Aflela Wilela, 2006, Contemporary Spanish Art Selections from Alicante in 2006, Contemporary Italian Art Exhibition 2005, and Nuevas Tendencias Fotografía in 2005 as well. Among his curatorial projects are the 11th, 12th, and 13th Cairo Biennales from 2008, 2010, and 2019, respectively. When Art Becomes Liberty, the Egyptian Surrealists, 1938 to 1965, at the National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Korea in 2017. 25 years of Arab creativity at the Institut du Monde Arabe, Paris in 2012, and still valid, a selection of contemporary Egyptian art practices at the Sharjah Art Gallery of the American University in Cairo in 2011. And our third speaker, Kudzya Rahim, is director of the Lahore Biennale and co-founder and executive director of the Lahore Biennale Foundation, a nonprofit aimed at engaging the arts as a medium of dialogue for community building. She previously worked as an associate professor and curator at the Zohar ul Akhlaq Gallery at her alma mater, National College of Arts. As a curator, she has organized artist residency exchange programs and research-driven exhibitions to have showcased works by local and international artists. Rahim is also the founder of the Research Cell, which is a part of the Lahore Biennale Foundation's outreach effort to encourage cross-sectoral collaboration on the domestic and international front, and strengthen art philanthropy and scholarly research in the visual and contemporary art fields. She initiated Afforestation Lahore, a scalable nationwide project that brings together stakeholders from the government and civil sector to combat loss of tree cover and address other urgent environmental challenges. She has been involved in independent curatorial projects as well, such as STET in 2014 and Everything is Embedded in History in 2015, both contemporary art exhibitions aimed at looking into modes of information dissemination through the arts. Her publications include Lahore Biennale Guidebook and Lahore Biennale Catalog from 2020, Lahore Biennale 1 Guidebook and Catalog, Lahore Biennale Reader from earlier, and Everything is Embedded in History 2015, and My East is Your West, The Viewer, The View, and Viewed 2015. She received a full scholarship for an MFA at Alfred University in New York and the Honors Award at the National College of Arts, Lahore. And with that, please join me in welcoming Nada Shabout to the virtual podium. Nada?
Thank you, John, very much for their generous introduction. And I am very pleased to be joining you all here in this virtual sphere. It is unfortunate that we're not in Sharjah, but hey, what can we do? It is a pandemic. So with that, let me share my screen. And today I will be going back in history as opposed to all the presentations that are about contemporary and current biennials. I'll be talking about a biennial that interestingly enough, sort of became or was remembered and became more popular, I think, during the first decade of the 21st century, which I think is quite telling in itself and would be an interesting situation to look back into why in the first decade of the 21st century, the Arab biennial was remembered and been studied in various ways. I think we also all notice that while we're trying to study it, there is not much out there for us to find. I think there are two ways to look at the biennials and the three iterations of them. We can look at them from a perspective of an artist mobilization, or we can look at them from a perspective of state formulation. I think both, of course, have validity to some extent, but I'm more interested in the artist mobilization. As a project, the biennial has been overclouded by its politics and seen as a failure. However, we really need to understand the genealogy of the biennial. Oh, let me change slides. Okay. The genealogy of the biennial, and which is in one aspect has its roots in a historical necessity that started through the artist initiative. The biennial was a culmination of the formation of the General Union of Arab Plastic Artists, اتحاد العام للفنانين العرب, which was formulated in 1971. It actually formulated to register a strong Arab artists' position and need for shared forum and unity. The awareness of their fragmented existence within what has been argued throughout most of the 20th century as a transnational collective strength in the form of Pan-Arabism was manifest in their need for better representation. As their contact increased through robust print media and scholarship programs, and they became more aware of each other's work or each other's existence, their desires for a stronger presence in the art scene equally intensified. Despite of the various critiques, controversies, and challenges, and there are many, and we can talk about some of those, I suppose, in the Q&A, the General Union of Arab Plastic Artists and the Arab Biennial have left historiographic legacies, both positive and negative, that necessarily express their generational occupation, aspiration, and failures. We must see it within that context. Otherwise, we miss the point of why, in fact, it was organized. Identity, the need to have a strong and distinct presence in artistic and intellectuals of the, I'm sorry, it's too early in Texas, so. The need to have a strong and distinct presence in a united front and for their art to find its place within modernism occupied artists and intellectuals for the region for most of the 20th century. The union and its biennials are also articulated the artists grappling and coming to term with both Arabism and world politics, but mostly the primacy of Palestine as a marker of Arab identity. As Pan-Arabism rhetoric climaxed, Arab artists' work became more interactive with each other. More importantly, the cultural crisis which accompanied the 1967 Nakba, the Arab army's rapid loss to Israel, added new demands on them. Correspondingly, a proliferation of cross-regional conversations and debates erupted. They tackled topics that centered on the properties of good art, as well as new art practices and contemporary theories appropriate for their moment. Their intention was to explore and define the role of the visual arts in the making of a future Arab culture. Moreover, this collective of artists was in many ways modeled to parallel the various other united Arab collectives that were taking place at the time, like the United Arab Engineers, the United Arab Writers, and so on. Their position also corresponded to certain political initiatives that centered around regional unity. In April 1971, the Federation of Arab Republics, uniting Egypt, Libya, and Syria, was announced and was effective from 1972 to 1977. It was not the first attempt to have the artists unite. In fact, the Arab League had tried earlier to organize a conference to unite all the Arab artists and bring them together, but it did not, it was not successful. And that's why it is, for me, it is more important to look at this from the artist's perspective because of the success that it would have. In fact, the way it started was by the artists themselves organizing it, a way for them to gather. They sent, for example, the artist Jamil Hamoudi. He was designated to take a trip around the major cities of the Arab world to discuss the initiative. In the summer of 1971, a small group of artists from Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon met in Beirut and collectively drafted the founding statement of the Union of Arab Plastic Artists. In December of the same year, the first Arab Conference of Fine Arts, المؤتمر العربي الأول للفنون الجميلة, was organized by the Syrian Association of Plastic Artists in Damascus. The program of the conference included several papers by artists like Mahmoud Hamad and Fatih al-Mudarris, along with a number of other major artists, discussing a range of topics that included the current conditions of Arab artists in the various Arab cities, positions of Arab artists within art, and a better representation on a international scene, as well as the struggles that they were all facing and their duties and obligations towards the Arab world. The conference culminated in the proclamation of a general union of Arab plastic artists as an umbrella organization with headquarters in Damascus that encompassed chartered national association. The founding statement was ratified by 7 artists as the union's first committee members representing 7 countries that included Iraq, Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Kuwait, and Sudan, with the hope that for the next step, artists from Jordan, Libya, Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria would join. The Palestinian artist, Smail Shammout, was announced as its first Secretary General. 4 of the committee members were appointed as representative at UNESCO, the Arab League, and the Arabian Gulf countries, and the Maghreb al-Arabi. It is clear that the ideological constitution of the union's board reflected the political affinities and desires of the time, with the centrality of the Palestinian issue. The main goal for the collective was clear in that it aimed to unite the scattered individual experiments and present a strong cultural and civilizational front. In a sense, it was a union, and it wanted to protect the artists that are part of the union in various ways in terms of their equal representation, but also international engagement. So, I mean, clearly there is the political, and let me look at some of the slides for a second. So you're looking at the meeting of the Arab artists in Damascus in 1971. And some more of and those are the main artists, the most important artists of their time. And so, you know, which meant it kind of had a strong weight for all the other artists to join as well. The main goal, nevertheless, its political role was also clearly argued. The union thus, in various ways, positioned itself as the official body of representation under state patronage that quickly moved the initiative from an artist collective concerned with aesthetics and exhibitions with a focus on unity to an equivalent of a semi-political party of sorts, which would consequently cause the union's rapid demise. The headquarters of the union moved from Damascus to Baghdad. Political situation of the time, of course, with the discovery of the oil revenues in Iraq made Baghdad a very fruitful place to join. There's no denying that the Ba'ath Party in Iraq found an opportunity within these regional developing sentiments to position Iraq as the regional leader on an intellectual and artistic level. So, you know, while the political system was trying to take advantage of the artist gathering, the artists themselves understood that, well, they needed money. And, you know, with money, they're able to do a lot of organization. And so we should think of this as a form of an alliance that may be, you know, an equal and possibly with a lot of issues that artists were aware of between the state and the artist. In April 1973, Baghdad hosted the first conference, and these are the, you know, some of the images that you're seeing from that conference. And they distributed the newsletter with its ideological framing statement. It was titled "Art Inspired by the People's Struggle and Liberation" in the trilogy of heritage, the present moment, and contemporaneity. The statement started with, the title and language of this openly ideological statement specifically reflected the criticality of the Palestinian struggle as situated within the third world frame of reference that continued to be used to charge emotions in the Arab world throughout most of the second half of the 20th century. This is probably why Smail Shammout, who was also involved in the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was to be the first Secretary General. And I'm, John, looking at you to signal me if I run out of time. So, you know, because I'm not keeping time. So some of the images of the second meeting of the in Baghdad as well. So Ismail Shammout played an important part of the formation of sort of the ideology of the General Union. And they together sort of, and as a result, it culminated in the organization of the first biennial. So it was the General Union that effectively organized the biennial, and it was first one to be in Baghdad, and then the second one was to be in Rabat in Morocco, December 1976, and a third less known one in Tripoli, Libya in 1980, as a matter of fact. So they kind of skipped the schedule a bit, and we're not sure why. We don't have much sort of details about it. I was very happy to be able to find a catalog finally of the Libya iteration. Some of the images that of the gatherings and what we found from the biennial. In accordance to the Ba'ath Arabization policy, so they didn't call it a biennial, Biennale, they called it actually Ma'rad al-Sanatain, which, the Ba'ath party Arabized everything in the language that they used. And the first biennial featured work from 14 countries: Algeria, the Democratic Republic of Yemen, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Morocco, Palestine, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Tunisia. Palestine was represented by the Palestine Liberation Organization, with its own pavilion as an equal of the other states, which is in itself, quite specific and poignant of the reason for their formation. In the forum convened along with the biennial, Shammout, who acknowledged challenges, logistical and otherwise, stressed its positive results. Speakers invited to contribute to the forum expressed a multitude of sentiments that were equally critical as well as self-congratulatory. Despite of acknowledged limitations, the Baghdad Biennial was accepted by most artists and critics across the region as a refreshing and worthy experiment positioned to enrich art production in the Arab world. What is most interesting is the debate around the format of the biennial that it instigated. In a manifesto issued by the Moroccan Association of Plastic Arts on the occasion of the biennial, they cautioned that the format of the biennial was not avant-garde enough for the Arab world and for what the Union had hoped to accomplish. In a special issue of the Al-Thaqafa Al-Jadida, dated March 1st, 1977, that presented a roundtable discussion among 3 of Morocco's leading artists that was sort of organized around the biennial in the issues about the biennial. Artists Mohammed al-Melehi, Farid Belkahia, and Mohammed Shab'a went as far as to criticize the concept of the biennial as a dying European official national representation, with the first Venice Biennale initiated under Mussolini, promoting a competitiveness akin to that of the Olympics. In their opinion, the biennial is a failed project in principle. Nevertheless, they cited added challenges for holding the second biennial in Morocco that included the country's lack of infrastructure and adequate support, as well as bureaucracy that delayed all preparation. On the other hand, Moroccan artist Fouad Belamin, in an interview in 1978, criticized the Arab Biennial as being unworthy to be named a biennial. He argued that it was a last-minute development without much planning, and that with the exception of the Iraqi and the Moroccan pavilions, the rest were mediocre. He argued that what the two had in common was the foresight to present works that could speak to the future, the Iraq and Morocco pavilions, to speak to the future without in any way disavowing or disowning their cultural heritage. In fact, the planning of the second Arab Biennial in Rabat instigated many controversies. A second art group named the Association of Moroccan Plastic Artists, was initiated in Casablanca to challenge the role of the official Moroccan Association of Plastic Artists that had assumed the leading role in affiliation with the General Union of Arab Plastic Artists in planning the biennial. The new group expressed dissatisfaction with the status quo in Moroccan arts. Thus, in response to what they evaluated as the official response, they planned a parallel exhibition they titled 20 Years of Plastic Arts in Morocco. I think it's kind of, it's really refreshing that there was this dialogue that was taking place among the artists, as well as the challenging of the status quo, even at the time when the status quo was still not necessarily, state organized, but in state alliance. Moreover, the quality of works of art accepted in the biennial were criticized by other artists as well. For example, and this is the cover of the catalog for the Iraqi pavilion, and in the Iraq iteration of it. And here are some images from the first Biennale. I'm sure there are more images out there, but we need to find them. So hopefully we will be able somehow to, in time, see more of these images before I get to the end. So for example, Iraqi artist Riyad Zawi, who had not participated in the first biennial in Baghdad because he was on military duty, he argued that the positive effect of the biennial in Baghdad for presenting good examples of modern negotiations of the national and local to Arab artists that helped aid them in their movement away from European model. In that way, he found it pedagogical. Which in turn spoke of a movement towards their shared goals. Nevertheless, he argued that it was neither competitive nor critical in relation to aesthetics or the production of good art, but rather presented the work in reductive context of nations incapable of crafting a united vision, adept to negotiate the proposed Arab unity. However, in relation to the Rabat Biennial, in which he participated, he criticized many of the participating artists for not abiding by the theme of the biennial, which was Palestine, and thus contributing to its failure and that of a united front. And in the third iteration, which, as I said, I finally found a catalog, which kind of maybe explains a lot about why it wasn't so popular, because while it was sort of, the biennial was political and politicized from its inception, but this last iteration in Tripoli, Libya, clearly, speaks more about the politics than it does about the art. The catalog has more of Gaddafi's Green Book excerpts and sort of quotations than it does about the art itself. But also, it had less participation. In addition to Libya, Jordan, Algeria, Yemen, Kuwait, Syria, and Iraq were the only countries that participated in the biennial. Now, we literally don't know more about it than what I have found in this catalog, because it was neither publicized, I think, or promoted to the extent that Morocco and the Iraq iteration did, but also possibly because by that point, it was already seen as a failure. And I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nada, for that rich and wonderful dive into the history of the Arab Biennale. I have an announcement to make, which is that Laban is not going to be able to join us due to technical difficulties. So we are going to skip ahead, and Kudzya now will be speaking. Kudzya Rahim will be speaking about the Lahore Biennale. So I'm going to hand things over to you, Kudzya.
Hi, thank you, John. Can you hear me? Perfect. All right, thank you so much for this opportunity. Nada, this was just beautiful. What a wonderful presentation. I learned so much. Thank you, John, and the Sharjah Foundation for doing this. I think one way, let me share my screen also. I think one way of doing this is speaking through the city. I think that is very important because the advent of Lahore Biennale, we can't separate that from the city. It is an integral part of who we are and our historical references. So if I may, yeah. So this is an image of Lahore Fort. I'm just very quickly going to read a bit about the city and its history. It's a very old city, about 200 years old, ruled by Hindus, Sikhs, Mughals, and colonized by the British, gained independence from the British rule in 1947, exposed to the wars of 1969 and 71, faced many dictatorships. Most damaging was under the Zia regime. And of course, you can imagine in the mix, we see a lot of immigrants and migrants, and we see a lot of movements and shifts. Home to activists and social movements throughout art, literature, and poetry. Those new movements of artistic expressions are part of the constitution of the city. It has period buildings, World Heritage Gardens, was a cultural capital of the undivided India. Historically, Lahore was a center of arts, especially miniature paintings. But then arts was pushed back in the background because of the both political and social economic issues. And this is again when the 80s time. Despite all else, the city of garden saints and Sufis has a resilient spirit and ownership amongst the citizens of Lahore. Lahore hai. So this is one of those favorite phrases that you would hear a lot. But I think it constitutes the city in a very small way. Pakistan has many of the third world issues. One must bring light to that as well. Cultural lack of cultural spaces, economic mobility, political and religious impediments, funding issues, absence of intellectual debates. People are working pockets, but there is no collective mobility. I think some of these reasons are behind what constituted the Lahore Biennale Foundation. We're a foundation first with a year-round calendar of activities. Its programming is geared towards publicness or publics. By creating multiple points of engagement, encourage research-based approach, and in the process, bring opportunities for the artists. This is just a small idea behind the foundation. So we started in 2014, and since we made it a conscious effort that we would actually work in the field before and get to know the stakeholders, get to understand the city infrastructure and ways of working before we could do the biennial. So in 2018, we initiated a first biennial as an inaugural event and program. Lahore Biennale chose to contextualize Lahore with reference to development in the region. Many local artists were invited to create new site-specific projects on scale and orientation towards publicness, and which is still emergent in Pakistan. Another objective was to recognize work being done with reference to South Asia and West Asia for building regional community, also because these areas tend to face similar issues. To learn from each other, similar experiences can lead to better learning experiences for people from the same region, since they share the same cultural context, much of which was largely unknown to the arts community at large in our country. So I think there are various ways that are important to us. Locations are important. I think the format of the biennial is such that since we don't have a purpose-built building or a place we operate from, it actually adds to our strength. And what we do is we go back in the city, we go back and engage with various possible locations. And we try and make it as public as possible. So these locations are the museums or Shahi Hammam or Mubarak Haveli, the garden, Bagh-e Jinnah, the Lahore Fort, where we already know a lot of people come and visit. So instead of bringing the biennial into, asking people to come into spaces that are devoid or new narratives need to be built, I think it was important for us to go to the people, go to the publics, and work with them and bring these artworks and projects to them and see how the city responds, because it was very important for us that the biennial is hosted by a city which is so rich in culture and tradition and value. So some of the works I would like to share with you. One of my favorite artists, Amar Kanwar, his works are extremely soulful. Since we're looking at the South Asian, the region closer, we also reached out to the people who were creating certain type of conversations as part of the art practice. The film follows a professor who retreats from his career, seeking isolation in an abandoned train station. So this is one of the works. I think this one was very important. Bani Abdi's work, this project pays homage to a national tragedy of World War I, when our men were taken to war with a false promise to return back soon, later finding out that they were the front line in the war. The project narrates a letter sent back to their families in a song. So, I mean, in the, this is part of the Lahore Museum. And this particular gallery talks about the war and war memorabilia, and the Queen Victoria's statue is already part of it, because we colonized for over hundred of years. So I think this was a very important work that was exhibited, and in a way to for us as a reconciliation, a way of dialogue, of reconnecting with our history. I think that was very important. If the Hardadi's work, this is again Summer Palace, as you see. This is a Summer Palace, part of Lahore Fort. If this work talks about this Ilama Iqbal's poem called Masjid. The poet. Sorry about that. My computer's about to die. I didn't realize that. I'm just going to put that into question. So Silsila also Shab, this work by Iftikhar Dadi, I think it was very important. His works are very, very strong, embedded in the pop culture of our country and the 80s. And he's looking at working through this work through the maze. And Silsila Rosu Shab means the cycle of day and night, and the cycle of, vulnerability that comes with it. These are works by Aisha Khalid on the right and Imran Qureshi on the left. Aisha Khalid's works responded to the rampant architectural or city planning and Osmanization, kind of built spaces that the city government sometimes in a third world country want to show progress, a sign of progress, apparently, building a lot of projects. And this particular project is called the Orange Line. and which is why you see the little line that goes through her work. They had taken over the Shahi Hammam, and the various aspects of architectural spaces were used for artistic expression. Like I said, sites are very important, but also going into public spaces is very important. This is Bagh-e Jinnah, Mehreen Murtaza's work, which is perhaps one of the most popular or revered works, in the sense that she took carefully calibrated a synthesizer and connected with the tree, and as somebody touched it, it made certain sounds. So it's, in a way, these beautiful sounds that the tree was making with the earth and the movement was one way of talking about the ecological concerns and the respect for nature, and then that these are living beings. And another project in the park was of Ali Kazim. It was really interesting, because what he did with this work was he created a ruin of hearts. And this is the Bagh-e Jinnah is full of these mounds, right? And these mounds used to be brick kiln factories at another time. But one of these mounds is known as a lover's mound. And what he did was create a ruin with hearts. And what he wanted the visitors was to actually take away as many as they wanted, and so it slowly disintegrated, right? And since they were made of clay, they also disintegrated with time within, the earth, and making dust to dust. Meanwhile, what he's doing these days is asking people to actually send pictures of the works that of how people have kept these hearts in their homes. And by doing so, what he is doing is collecting all this material to further work on a project, perhaps. What the biennial was able to do was open up the space a bit, and a lot of artists and artwork, because of lack of space, we never, the arts community may be aware of them, but public in general was completely isolated. And since there were not many conversations that were happening, clearly a lot of artworks were not being exchanged. So I think Shazia Sikandar's Parallax was another example of an artist whose hometown was Lahore, was now actually coming back to her place, and a large scale exhibition was arranged with other works as well. So the city and the country was able to see the fabulous work that she has been engaged with. So post Lahore Biennale first edition, of course, we had been wondering our next steps and how to build the dialogue further. We initiated. We were introduced to Hur through a mutual friend, Salah Hassan, and it was very important for us to open the region. We wanted to. The idea behind the foundation was to bring artwork and artists and conversations through art and build on those various conversations, but it was also to create a larger network, and the network of through our neighbors. We've been neighbors for a very long time, but did we ever have cultural conversations, dialogues with them? So what the opportunity that working with Hur brought to us was to opening up this region in a very expansive way. These conversations have not been happening for a very long time. Some of them are conflict countries. Some of them have just not had the opportunity to work with each other. So Between the Sun and the Moon opens up the South Asia, MENASA region, including the Crater, Middle East, Africa, and Arab states, and its diaspora. I think that was Hoor's magic in this all, where through her experience, she was able to create a larger conversation. The Biennale questions identity in the global South, colonial legacies, the rise of modern identities, have hardened the differences across ethnic, religious, linguistic, and national affiliations. Dissonance between and amongst humans have compounded over the recent years, and a crisis born out of humanity's alienation with nature. So I think this biennial by itself is very complex in its nature and in its coming together. This happens through travel, production of work, initiation of talks and cultural travel. This biennial also introduces already neighbors to culture and creative dialogue full of imagination and possibilities. Again, the idea was to make this biennial absorb in the city in ways that we are not creating isolated events or isolated points of engagement, but actually creating multiple points of engagement and creating the publicness of the biennial, and going to the people was very important. And so I think, so the first biennial, we had 7 locations, but the second biennial, we have 13 locations, and we can talk about those a bit later. So another aspect of the biennial is to open up spaces and repurpose perhaps spaces that doesn't have same level of engagement. So for example, Bradley Hall was one of the buildings that was not in circulation, and we went in, we cleaned it up and brought artworks and brought it alive through that, or the planetarium. So another opportunity that we see this kind of engagement bring to us naturally is because we are not location bound. We can play and experiment with size and scale and medium, and all kinds of possibilities arise. This is Diana Al-Hadid's work. It's a recreation of Anarkali's tomb as a strong symbol of power, and brought into the Chahar Bagh of the Diwan-e-Am at the Lahore fort as a symbol of resistance and power. So, or for example, White Shawky's work. In this particular work, he revisits his project Cabaret Crusade, the trilogy, in a local context with using our history and our legacy and the building, and it completely changes the project and the conversations and becomes, you know, local, but at the same time, you know, connected through history. So this is also Lahore Fort. This is a 14-channel audio piece titled Hum by Hajra Wahid, in which she's taken 14 poems of resistance, and she has created a an audio piece, a sonic piece, and a sound shower through that. Did I miss? I think one of the most successful interventions and was at the Lahore Planetarium, where Almagul Min Labayava, German Popov and Ina Artimova, they created this fantastical, super realistic, not super realistic, but research-based project of research on the 14th century scholar Ulugh. So he's a Persian scholar, and she's traced the roots of this and journey of the scholar, and realized that, you know, through Persia, Central Asia, subcontinent and Afghanistan, this person has a legacy and a lineage that this person has left behind. So collecting all the data, creating this fantastical piece in the planetarium, which was actually lying abandoned because the Orange Line had taken over all the space. And now we had the ability to go in and clean it up and repurpose it and bring it back into the circulation. We have many, as part of the biennial, we have a lot of commissioned artworks. We were one of the commissioning bodies in this, Sabah Khan, and the Pak Khawateen Club. This is the journey to the various barrages and dams on the river Indus, and talking about the water politics. That brings this, of course, the big concern that in 2050, Pakistan will not have sufficient drinking water for its people, and then all, so there's a whole lot of conversation that's going on, and, there are various mitigation plans, but then at the same time, that's a given reality and a ticking bomb. She looks into those with her friends, Pak Khawateen, going on a journey looking like officials, but actually they're all artists, but official bodies like official uniform, and going into various places, engaging with people and bringing through conversation, creating artistic expression. I think Barbara Walker was very important. Her work was very important, and her journey to come to Pakistan to create these drawings and taking weeks to work on them. It was a strong symbol of resilience and perseverance, and that identity that is created over time. And then when she came back towards the end, like most of her work, the erasure that happens so quickly when you just clean these spaces and these drawings, which are magnificent and purely beautiful. So this was our second biennial. We have, the foundation has a year-round calendar of events, but then also these biennials that happen every 2 years. This was a second biennial, and all kinds of conversations were created through this, and a certain mobility was brought in a city where arts is not one of our top priority, where conversations and research-based work, while in some cases very important, but you don't see much of that engagement of publics and inclusion of publics, democratic space for the arts. I think it was really nice to see some of those points in the city and that people behave and come together with different demographic people from different demographic backgrounds would come together and into these spaces and create memories together. Thank you. So John, that was a brief overview. Should I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kudzya. It's great to see the slides from the second Biennale, which of course I had the pleasure of visiting last year. And part of what you said definitely rings true, I think, is about creating memories together and that sense of community and gathering. And that also evokes something that Ming Tianpo in her talk yesterday for the Art and Civic Imagination panel, was talking about the way that art itself could be a space, or could offer a space for a kind of common ground for discussions, whether political or otherwise. And it seems to me that, part of the aim of the Lahore Biennale is precisely to kind of create that kind of space for a kind of engagement. And could you say a little more about the kind of the larger the larger kind of thinking, behind the foundation and kind of how it situates maybe within your thinking about, because you also brought up the question of Lahore itself as being a city rich with culture and tradition. So maybe if you could say a little about how, how you're thinking about the Biennale and the foundation vis-a-vis that site, I guess.
Thank you, John. I think city by itself is nothing unless it is saturated with people, and people bring history, and history brings all kinds of threads of conversations that are then built through them. So I think, so when I was talking very, very briefly about the historical context, what makes us today post 1947 is also certain movements and shifts that are part of our fabric. For example, the WAF movement, which is very rudimentary for, WAF stands for Women's Action Forum, which was created right after the Hudud Ordinance, right? Where, the city, where the government is enforcing impediments or enforcing certain, conditions on the people, right? Or for example, a little bit before that, when we look into the Halqa-e-Bab-e-Zawq, or the men of fine thinking. Men in this case is neutral gender, because there were plenty women part of this this campaign also, and they're very noteworthy work in it. Or the progressive writers movement. Now these movements, if you look at historically speaking, come and root between arts and literature and poetry. They're not isolated events, and they're not, so a lot of times, writers and would be speaking to each other through text in the newspapers. And we have these very well recorded histories, because it's not past yet, and it's not been that long, that all of this is part of our training, of our upbringing, and many of these people are still alive. So they're living, breathing examples of resistance, of movement, of agency of the arts. So while all of this is there, we are going through a certain level of dictatorship and certain level of social economic pressures, I must say, sometimes religious pressures. So all of these things, build the fabric of what we are today. I think who we are today. But all of these things also, what it does is these social economic factors also push arts in the background, and somehow, things that were second nature to you become a luxury. And I think those things are very important to a lot of us. And because we grew up in certain families, art and culture was part of our everyday living. And now, due to certain shifts in conditions, all kinds of restrictions were there. So I think the foundation is in response to those conditions. The foundation is in resistance to those conditions. And I think it's very important that we were a foundation before we started the biennial, right? We needed to operate within the city limitations, and to see how we can give agency to the arts, how we can bring conversations and build a community through these conversations. There was a time not too long ago when the local conditions of our country were becoming questionable, and a lot of local international community was like, what is happening here? But that's not the Lahore, not the Pakistan I know. So it is our responsibility that we look into these conditions and respond as citizens of the larger community. So the foundation is in response to that. And the idea was to work a little bit within the field, engage with people, the stakeholders, right? Like the government becomes a stakeholder. If we want to work in public space, the government and those permissions and the facilitation is very important. engaging, because there's lack of funding, we needed to engage with the sponsors and potential sponsors to actually now invest in the arts as a means of expression. And it also make the artists think, who were previously known to make object-based art or drawing room art, because there's a lack of museum and cultural spaces, institutions and county institutions. So they are making drawing room art. They're making paintings that are small. They're making miniatures that are small that can be hung on the walls of people's homes. And the people were also the collectors of these artworks. So now making them think about the public, making them think about the publics, and making them think about community, and changing that mindset and inviting everybody to these now new dimensions and new spaces and scales. I think that was some of the main objectives behind the foundation, and the publicness was important. Engaging, bringing opportunities to the artists was important. How can you ask somebody to work differently when there are no opportunities? So I think, making people actually feel proud, like the sponsors feeling proud of supporting the arts, the government feeling proud to support the arts. I think those things are really important to us. And we have been very effectively working with the government and the sponsors so far. And we find ourselves quite fortunate in that it was easier. It is hard work, but it's easier to convince. It was very easy to convince. It was easy to make them feel that it is their responsibility to support the arts as well. So in arts, so I think those kind of things, what prompted the foundation, we did a bit of work, and then we did the biennial. We keep reviewing and rethinking and taking stock by speaking to people. So I think lots of programming are very important, like Art Speak or academic talks or community talks or town hall style meetings. We continue having them. So we understand where we are with the people and how we can build further. And a lot of decisions are made based on the response we get.
That's a really interesting commentary on the kind of the larger goal of the Biennale and also the foundation. I mean, on the one hand, it does something spatially in the sense of it situating, the project within the place. And I use place deliberately because it's simultaneously very specific, Lahore, but it's also in some ways a little kind of generalized, right? It also refers to a kind of larger network and larger geography. And I'm seeing, and chronologically too, because it dissolves the Biennale's work within a kind of a larger timeline, right? It's not just like, oh, this month or these 2 months. It's kind of all year round, every year, not just every 2 years, right? And in that sense, it kind of shows us some of the kind of the behind the scenes, or maybe kind of the back office conversations that are also happening, and not just, what most people think of as the work of the biennial, which is the exhibition, right? And I see Nada nodding here. And because I think in some ways there's interesting parallels, even though, the Arab Biennale and the Lahore Biennale are very different, right? I mean, one is taking place in Pakistan, one is taking place within the quote unquote Arab world, right? But in both cases, they are about building constituencies, and they are both kind of the biennials themselves are situated within a much larger project, it seems. And I was wondering if you want to say a little about that.
Yeah, but I first want to say, Qudsia, I so enjoyed your presentation because unfortunately, I have not been able yet to make it to Lahore. At first, it was going to be a visa issue. So, I'm sorry?
We must invite you.
Well, thank you. But I wanted to the first iteration, and there was a visa issue that we Americans assume that we can just hop on a plane and go somewhere. But clearly, which is good to remind us that we need to get visas sometimes. But I do intend to go, and I have been following up on things. What I really like about what, for example, biennales like the Lahore Biennale is doing, and to some extent the Sharjah Biennale as well, and the Istanbul Biennale, is the regional connection that, to me, as an art historian, is not only refreshing, but it's actually very important in our efforts to decenter the Europe as sort of the focus, right? So if we're wanting to look at art history from a more complicated, let's say, perspective, then I think, these biennales are offering us this sort of way of looking at things. Even when we look at the Arab Biennial in the 1970s, and if we looked before the 1970s, because this is a moment when sort of Pan-Arabism, however it was understood, and it's completely different on its cultural understanding than it is on state level and politics. And in fact, I would continue to argue that while it failed politically, culturally, it sort of even picked up more and became more successful after the political failure. I think it always existed before, and trying to organize it, kind of around sort of certain issues or historical, moments, was a more of a political problem than it was a cultural fluidity. But even before the Arab Biennial, the Arab world, Iraq, for example, there's some references in the literature about Indian art exhibition. So there is this sort of look to the other side, as opposed to many of the artists who were trained in Europe at that point, where in bringing with them sort of that European understanding of modernism. And I think as an art historian, I've always wanted to be able to explore these connections, and I am so pleased to see that that the Lahore Biennial, for example, allows us that in a much easier way. But to go back to your comment about building communities and through the Arab Biennial, I mean, absolutely. That's why I would say that there's just no understanding of the biennial without understanding of the general union of the Arab artists, because it was that moment of time where artists were wanting to meet each other, wanting to do things with each other. There were issues like, for example, the journal Adab that was published in Beirut, where they would have voices from the different parts, and this journal gets to some places with limitations. We have to remember that while there was a lot being published in press, particularly local newspapers, these local newspapers were not getting to the other cities in the Arab world. That was there were political problems of mobility, despite of the fact that there's the need for, or the desire for, unity. So through organizing things like the Arab Biennial, which, by the way, right before it, and the reason why it went to Baghdad and sort of, the first iteration is seen, at least on the level of the art that was included, as successful. It followed the Al-Wasati exhibition. That was the first sort of art festival that happened the year before, in 1970. Yeah, and that also included many artists from around the Arab world. So it wanted to build a community, but it was very sort of, again, really politicized even from its beginning in terms of what kind of community it wanted to build. That's, yeah.
Yeah, and that actually raises a kind of a question that I was going to bring up a little later, but actually also one of our audience members, Anthony Gardner, raised, which is, how conscious or aware were the artists in the union of these other examples? You mentioned Al-Watsi festival, from the year prior, but even before that, there was, the first, what we could call the first Festac, the World Black and African Festival from the 60s, the Triennale in Delhi in 1968. So there were these, examples of kind of federating activities or events that were meant to kind of bring people together, right? Or, Shiraz Persepolis, which begins also in the late 60s. Like, it seems like in the late 60s, there is this kind of, crest of these cultural manifestations, right? And so was this part of their conversations? Was this part of something you were able to find?
So to some extent, because we have to also remember, because of the political situation and because the sort of that pan-Arabism at that moment was a bit myopic in terms of looking into an Arab unity as opposed to opening, but also, however, at the same time, because Palestine and was such an important issue, they looked for alliances outside of the Arab world. But they were not looking at Iran, for example, which it's the current history or that contemporary history was still too raw for them to figure out how to form the unity. So there is this inward looking and only converging with other struggles, let's say, around the world because of the issue of struggle. So, because to be honest, I think the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, on the other hand, had more connections. I mean, you see in the literature things about Chile. You see in the literature, certain references, but not on that wide level. Few individuals may have known about these, but they would have no access to much of the like any publications from it, except for this sort of the odd thing from here and there, which is kind of interesting because I mean I continue to ask a lot of the older generation artists about their knowledge of what was happening on the other side, and they only knew what they were allowed to know, pretty much, what was allowed to kind of come across. And in organizing these Arab activities, yes, I mean, I remember Ibrahim Salahi told me, for example, he knew what was happening in the world from the magazine that he would find in the Iraqi embassy. So there are, cities that may have known more about what was happening than other places. In the Arab world in itself, when we say that, I mean, it's large. So it's not talking about one country. And it was, extremely complicated by its politics and socioeconomic issues and various other, I mean, it was the sort of post-colonial moment at the same time. And so there were many issues that they were grappling with that forced them to look internally as opposed to look regionally.
Yeah, and actually the example that Anthony Gardner was wondering about is the Alexandria, and the question of evoking the Mediterranean world, right? If that was something that, maybe would pierce the consciousness, I guess, in some ways, or entered into their stream.
Yeah, well, they were aware of it. They were aware of it. But, were they looking at it as a model? Doesn't look like it. Or, were they trying to understand how to exist in a larger sort of, pattern? It doesn't seem like it.
Okay. Yeah, and it was an interesting point that you brought up that, like even the name of the Arab Biennale, right? I mean, Marid al-Sanatain is not like, it was trying to distinguish itself from a Western biennial because it was taking kind of, it wasn't transliterating the name or the word Biennale, right? And I do want to point out, there's a comment or a few comments about, where they can find out more information about this Biennale. And there is this lovely publication from the Sharjah Art Foundation from an exhibition that took place that was prepared by Tariq Al-Fatou, that was from 2014. The time is out of joint. And I'm very happy to announce that Asia Art Archive was part of this project in small part. So I'm showing you the double volume of this, which contains both contemporary essays as well as historical documents. And in addition to that, there's also, of course, the co-edited volume that Nada, you put together, Modern Art in the Arab World, which includes a section on the biennales, 2 iterations of them, right?
Right, and actually, in the Modern Art Iraq Archive, maya.org, we have some of the primary documents. So I've the Marad al-Sanatain, the first, the Baghdad one, and there is a whole sort of book the lectures and the papers that were presented that I actually digitized, but I have not uploaded on Maya, although the University of North Texas gives access to the the digital format of it. So I mean, you know, we're trying to provide these more about this information. I'll upload the Libya one soon, hopefully.
Wow, great. Okay, thanks. And since we're talking about questions of models and examples, you know, in the case of the Arab Biennale, Kudzya, I was wondering if you could say a little more, you know, if there were, when you were, you know, when you eventually did think about, you know, what the Lahore Biennale could be, were there examples of perennial exhibitions that you took to be really kind of important ones? I mean, you mentioned, you know, kind of cultural examples within Lahore of the movements and literary and cultural associations, but were there kind of biennials that you thought were kind of like, you know, catalysts for your own thinking?
I think Nada spoke a few very important points. Looking inwards and censorship in a certain way, right? When the information is controlled and shared with care. I think while there were a lot of movements and shifts that were part of the making of who we are today, but it was very important for us to look inwards also, because there was a lot of damage that was done and through colonial past or the dictatorship or the other factors. So I think before we were looking outwards, we had to look inwards. We had to actually take a stock of where we were, who were we today, and what the parallel narratives were. I think the first biennial primarily explores that, inviting various people, mostly locally and South Asia, which is why I think it was very important for us to connect with our own people first. Which is why it was very important for us for this biennial foundation to be homegrown, which is why the limitations of perhaps not having a purposeful building was kind of our strength, in which we were able to go and move into other locations and create a larger conversation. I think we were looking at lots of biennials at that time when I was, you know, in the beginning. We were, of course, you know, the larger biennials like the Documenta and Manifesta, of course, they have that, you know, charisma and that mobility of an agency to the artists in the art world. But then also we were looking, those were too big for us, those were too fancy for us, and those were not what we wanted to work from the beginning. And with our social economic conditions such, perhaps those were not, a budget biennial was our way to go. And then we were like trying to see conversations because of the healing that we needed to do, because we get engaged into. We were looking at regionally also. So the connection for us was very much so that we look at what was happening in India, we were looking at what was happening in Dhaka, we was looking what was happening in Sri Lanka, we definitely looking what was happening in Sharjah, because that's where I think a lot of soulful thinking was happening. Because the interesting thing is that it's very easy to try and emulate a Western module, but how do you create that sense of ownership and the pride that comes with it, and the connection that we needed to build within a region before we actually grow out. So I think Sharjah was one of very important modules for us, in which Sharjah is not like other Arab Emirati countries where it's invested in the glam of it all, but the conversations that it makes, the connections it makes with the African world, or which is, you know, its neighbors over there, or South Asia, or elsewhere. There are already various artists that Sharjah was working with. And the kind of like March meetings, you know, these kind of thinking platforms, they were very important, and they're easy to connect. It's easy to connect for us and find parallels to countries from within our region. I think that was very important. So I think those kind of things were very important. And I think a great work is done in Kochi. I think the way that the biennial sits in the city and the city absorbs it and take ownership of it, and the people take ownership. I think that would be an ideal condition for us, right? That is what we are aspiring. I think the way Sharjah connects the region and that conversations and threads that were generational, and what who did for a biennial, I think that was again a very beautiful thing, that how various so while we work with commissioned artworks, a lot of them were commissioned artworks, but it was also important what work while Chowki had done at some point, or David Ajay, John Akamfra had done at another point, or Harir Sarkeesian had done, and bringing those conversations into Lahore as a means of expanding the horizon, expanding the borders, and opening a lot of like doors that were shut, or windows that never existed. I think those were the kind of things that we were successfully able to get to. And I think that and for Pakistan to see, so many artists and names and artworks that meant something to them, and it's easy to relate, so when the histories are similar, it's easy to build the dialogue, it's easy to relate. So I think regarding the format and the form of biennials that we were looking outside of our space was definitely some of these.
Okay. Interesting. And I think, you make a really kind of important point about the necessity and the importance of looking inward and kind of knowing exactly what it was, knowing what it is that you need or what Lahore needs, right?
Sorry, the internet connection went off for a bit.
Oh, I was just saying that, you make a really important point that, before you look outwards to kind of other models, I mean, it was important for you to kind of better understand what it was, to gauge what Lahore needs in terms of, as a city, as a site, as a place, and what were the kind of the gaps that the Biennale could fill, the needs that it could address, right? I think that's a really interesting point.
Actually, if I may just sort of jump in and say that, in a way, this is similar to what the Arab artists were doing through the Arab Biennial, position themselves. And so, it's looking inward to understand what you're doing, but also to understand how to position oneself. And I think this is specifically what, I mean, you're so right, Kudzya, to talk about how, let's say, the documenta or these are they're so big. Their reach and their goals are completely different than something that is more intimate, I'm going to say, not smaller, because I think the conversations that are projected through whether the Lahore Biennial or Sharjah are very sort of reaching and very complex. But I think it's the intimate nature, scale, maybe the cities, I don't know, that allows for this inward at the same time and outward, because it does bring the different parts of the region together. Something that, at that moment of history for the Arab Biennial, was not their objective, but something that possibly would have made the biennial a much richer space if they looked for connections outside of the Arab world. But at that historical political moment, they needed to understand who they are, how do they fit, and have power and unity. So to them, that was a very important part. The thing is, what is interesting about the Arab Biennial is that, at least for those who remain kind of, believers in Arab unity and some form of Arabism, the idea of the Arab Biennial has been discussed at different times by different people about bringing it back. Let's bring the Arab Biennial back and see where we can take it. And I could tell you that at the opening of Madhaf, when we were planning the exhibitions, the Told and Told Retold was, in fact, in certain ways, a replacement of what would have become a biennial, but we were so against it. I, for one, argued against an Arab biennial. I mean, we've lost that moment. So, it's gone. We're not going to force Arab unity, where many of the artists, particularly prior to 2011, would not want to be called Arab artist anymore. They want to be called Lebanese artist, Palestinian artist, Iraqi artist. Now, 2011 and the so-called, Arab revolts brought some of that back, but in a very different understanding, in a very different way. Because we now do need more the connections that Lahore Biennial, brings us, or the Sharjah Biennial brings us, where it's not about a concept, but it's about a city, about different ideas, different communities coming together, learning, understanding, and yes, indirectly. And as an art historian, I also see them as a way of countering the hegemonic sort of, art history canon of the West and and decentering. So I think they serve different political sort of, aspects that, an Arab biennial, for example, will not be able to do at this moment.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. I mean, I think that, the question of what kind of unity or what kind of solidarity work a biennial could do, or what a biennale can do, right? It was interesting when you were doing your presentation, because here we have, with this panel, two examples, one that's very, very historical and one that's very, very contemporary. And when we're looking at the black and white photos of the Arab Biennale, it's interesting because, with the last panel, for instance, all of the speakers are talking about things that have happened in the last, 5 years or something like that, and everything is about the present. Because we think about the Biennale form as being about the present, if not about the future. And here with your presentation, we're definitely looking at a biennial, with 40 years distance, right? So it definitely feels like the past. And so there's an interesting way the temporality of the biennial shifts when we're thinking about that,
Absolutely. But what is also interesting is that they, 40 years ago, were actually thinking that they're looking for the future, not the contemporary. So, their objective was sort of projecting to the future, as opposed to working with the contemporaneity of issues, which I think possibly also contributed to its failure. Of course, on the surface, the artist who, in many, it happens a lot where artists align with the state, at certain points, because there's something useful happening. At that point, they thought, okay, it has been too sort of usurped by the political, by the states, by the political power, that they did not want to be part of it anymore. So, which is also, interesting how that idea was then just abandoned. Now the Wasati Festival continued. And there were different, ways for the artists to come together. But, I'm discovering that through the archives, that there are several moments of sort of political alliance, whether it's UNESCO, whether it's, some sort of an international format that artists participate in, and then they just abandon immediately.
Yeah, I think the question of state patronage is an important one. I mean, I think Kudzya, you had brought up, the need to kind of think about the different stakeholders, right? And the idea that, it's not just the city of Lahore, it's also the Punjab region that, needs to become a stakeholder in the biennial format. And so it's kind of, how you as organizer, the artists union, had to work with certain kind of state powers in terms of accomplishing what they wanted to do, right?
Absolutely. I think when we say we want to work in a public space or bring art into the public realm, one of the biggest challenges that we face immediately is who are the stakeholders there? Who are the people occupying these spaces? So in one capacity is the government, who gives you permission to use these locations, or certain departments that actually is responsible for the well-being of these places. And then the visitors who actually come, in our case, the historical sites or parks or the places, there are these people also who also occupy and actually stakeholders in that space, and then vendors and other people. So there are lots of layers of various forms of communities that engage with one singular space. So it's, while government being perhaps one of the strong-willed, there are others who are maybe more delicate, but they have to be equally considered. Sometimes I think we have to also look at the non-human agency as well in this space, in this place of parks and other places that we use. So I think it was very important that from the beginning, from the get-go, we not actually jump to doing a biennial first, but actually because we were doing it for the first time, and it was the first ever Pakistan International exhibition where artists were coming and their works were coming from abroad and then being exhibited. So it was very important for us to go step by step. There is no hurry, right? There is no right and wrong, but it was important to measure your step and expand as much as is permissible within your own means. So I think it was, so while we established in 2014, we actually did the biennial in 2018, which I was very happy that we got this time to actually experience what it means. So clearly, out of the mix when we are studying, so I really go into these places and study and sit, and sometimes I conduct these meetings over there also, just sit in the park and absorb and see what other people, when the artworks are up, just watch people watching these artworks and the conversations that are happening and taking place. So one of the major stakeholders is definitely the government, and perhaps one of the trickiest ones. We had a bit of a time to actually work on it. And what we did was we take all these examples of fantastic work that's happening everywhere in the world. We give them presentations. We get them excited about the fact that your city is actually hosting and is going to be hosting this biennial. And what does it mean? Frankly speaking, the word biennial or biennale, yes, they're one of our strongest supporters now. They've given patronage to us. And next time, Nada, when you're coming, anybody's coming, now we have patronage. The visas and other things are not a problem because the city takes complete ownership and given the biennial its patronage. It took a lot of time convincing them, showing them examples. So I remember Qudsia Biennial had submitted on the website a impact report. I printed that impact report, brought to the government and said, look what a biennial can do for a city or a country, and how does it mobilizes economy, how does it mobilizes local communities, how it brings people together, how it opens up various perspectives which were close to them, and open up spaces. And little by little, we were able to make headway. So now permissions for these locations, permission to invite people. I remember my first meeting when we were trying to get an NOC, in non-objection notice, was a very difficult one, in which they were like, oh, but do it like a 4-day event instead of like, 6-week of event. And I'm like, no, but that can't happen. And then a dialogue went on, and then eventually they agreed. So it was like small steps that took us to this place. But today, Lahore is one of the UNESCO cultural city. Lahore is one of UNESCO City of Literature. Several after Hoor's Biennial, we had like a huge influx of people in thousands with biennial travelers and institution, curators and directors of various institutions and such. Mobility happened, and the projection that we got that we have now been on several platforms. Lahore is one of the must-go-to cities in the world. Those kind of things. It changed so much for the city, and it changed gave it such mobility that the government now looks forward to doing the biennial, the next biennial. So they keep asking me, why do you skip a year? So what are you doing next? But the nice thing in all of this that I must say that I mean, of course, it is a lot of work, and it made us, gave us a lot of mobility. But at the same time, they've never enforced any, you know, like nobody ever asked me, you must add this artist to, or ask me favors or those kind of things. I would say we were completely lucky in that capacity, that while there are all kinds of forms of government and government officials, the mobility has been beautiful for us, and we are not requested anything. Nobody sees our work that we put up beforehand. So they're not we don't have a government intervention in our in the work that we do. In fact, when we're doing it, they say, oh, okay, they're doing it, it's going to be nice. It's going to be good. So maybe the critical thinking, the way we are thinking, they're not thinking in the same way, but they do understand by mobilizing us. There is a certain mobility that brings to the country that is very effective, and it is optimistic for a brighter future, for creating these various, to take charge of our narrative. But at the same time, they sometimes the families come to see the artworks. I know, you know, what is he called? One of the top officials of the country, of the city, the CM's wife came to see one of the sites, and Sabah Khan's work was there. You talk about water politics. Another person's work was there, was talking about, you know, erosion, erasure of history and those kind of things in other works. And she came and she saw all the work, and then she felt good, and then she left. She never, you know, she said, you're doing good work. So governments can take a lot of pressure also, is what I'm saying. But the important thing was for me to keep them with me, not use them or not see them as an antagonist point of view, but actually, I would say when the visitors would come from abroad, I would say, please come and meet them. Please come and meet this artist. Please come and meet, you know, this curator who's come from abroad. And you know, the more they were informed, the more they felt empowered, the more they understood, and the more they were ready to support.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's a really important point.
From a place of complete, like, economic and otherwise complete meltdown on one level to bringing everything together and becoming one of our forces. So
that's great. But that's exactly, for example, what was not what the Arab Biennial was doing, right? I mean, it came from above. The government did everything. I mean, they had no other options anyway. So state patronage is the model in many places. It would have been interesting to have the Cairo Biennial perspective and the Istanbul Biennial perspectives here, because again, the different models of the biennials of today, you know, tell us a lot about how the system is working, how, you know, education is working. So I applaud you, Qudsia, for saying that, you know, you're not in a rush. You don't need to do it all, you know, and not a sort of a big explosion glamour thing, but building up the structure, I think, is a very important thing, which, you know, hopefully guarantees the success of the biennial, but which the Arab Biennial did not have. The state was interested. The state was only, you know, Iraq, particularly the Ba'ath Party, had a very interesting sort of connection or understanding of the arts. Not literature, right? Literature is too obvious. You know, if if it's an art of contest or protest, it's too obvious. Not the visual. Although in Iraq, during the Ba'ath regime, you had to actually be a member of the party to attend the College of Fine Arts. So they understood the role of propaganda in the arts. But for whatever strange reason, the Ba'ath never interfered in what should be exhibited, what shouldn't be exhibited, beyond do the portraits of Saddam, and commissioning, which was not necessarily something the artist worried about. They will accept the commission, it paid good. And they had their own sort of, way of dealing with it. So it's kind of interesting, relationship between states and the visual arts.
Oh. So I'm getting messages from our organizers that we're running out of time. So I do want to get to some of the great audience feedback that we've been getting. Lots of appreciation for both of you, so do check those out. But maybe to get to a related question to what we're just talking about now, a question from Ming Tianpo. Who was a speaker in the Art and Civic Imagination panel yesterday, what kind of solidarity work can biennials do? So that was her kind of question and comment in some ways. It's an important question, and it did come up in their panel yesterday. And I think the question of, art and biennials offering a kind of common ground, right? And I think, Kudzya, it's something that you're addressing in a very kind of hands-on practical way, but I think can be also thought of in a kind of larger sense, I think, as Nada, you were suggesting. And I don't know if either of you would like to say any more on that, or.
So there, the East European biennials have an association, right? And it's really nice to see how. Point is, first, the conversation needs to start. It can always take whatever shape and form, and whatever kind of collaboration can happen. Sometimes it can be a very technical collaboration, and other times, one can create possibilities of imagining new ways of engagement and new biennials and new threads. And a lot of times, for example, after, seeing the kind of work and the conversations that East European biennials are having, I was like, my God, maybe we need to have the South Asian Greater Area biennial. There is a solidarity amongst us already a bit, although India and Pakistan are not politically aligned, but our souls are quite connected. And I remember when I was starting the biennial and I called the Karachi Biennial Bose and his colleague, and they were like, okay, so Kudzya, you need to do this, this, and this, and think about this, and don't forget your elderly. Those kind of things, right? And then when we look at Sharjah Biennial, from the first biennial, they've been helping us. So sometimes, whether it was technical help, whether it was collaborative work, whether we worked on a couple of commissions together with the second biennial. And, it was really interesting how these kind of supports can lend itself to new possibilities and new imaginations. And I think that's what it wants. That's what a biennial is, a possibility of a future, of a present, of dialogue at the end of the day, building, community building. So I think solidarities between the biennials, while they all are quite individual and they have their own character, it's really important. I remember for the first biennial, Berlin Biennial, Anje came from there to talk to us about how to think and how to conduct a biennial. So sometimes something as simple as that is very helpful, and sometimes complexities where Anje is helping us create programs together. We build programs together or various projects. I think those kind of things are more predictable, but then these conversations are important to create more untangible affiliations.
It's definitely different kind of solidarity than, for example, the Arab Biennial, which was all about creating political as well as community solidarity among the Arab artists because of the union, but also the pulling sort of the artists together to teach each other, to create a forum of critique and possibilities, thinking of it, it's a very different moment of history where, mobility meant something completely different than it does now. But I think, I think actually what I like now, because I mean, it was a very sort of ideological solidarity for the Arab Biennial. What I do like about whether Sharjah, Lahore, they're city sort of connected, city bound, but they are actually very they project
porous.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they bring all these sort of interactions and intersections and solidarity among artists. Pakistan and India may have not been, be politically aligned, but the artists, are aligned over various issues.
Yeah. And I think that maybe addresses the question that Christina Talbot asked, which is, reflecting on the past two panels, how can new biennials in Asia and the Middle East benefit from the experience of biennials like Sharjah, right? And I think where you're kind of addressed it very beautifully in terms of, the kind of like even the little things that can kind of make a difference, right? Just offering advice about how to do it, the pragmatic advice to kind of these larger questions about alliances. And I think the question of mediation, right? Like how it is, and maybe the difference between, a biennial like Sharjah or Lahore and something like the Arab Biennale is that, there are mediators working with Sharjah and with Lahore that kind of help make it work in a way that maybe, the Arab Biennale at that point wasn't quite thinking about the work of the curator, right? It was kind of more like, here's some artwork, right? Yeah.
Absolutely, there's no role for the curator, yes.
Okay, we have time for one last question, and it's a question for you, Nada. It's asked very early, actually, from Nasser Azayani, who says, you mentioned the establishment of the first biennials as reactions to political agendas addressing the Naksa specifically. Do you think the trend for biennials in the early 21st century reflects a similar reaction to the instability in the region and war in Iraq?
Well, I mean, we think of art and artists, they think of their art in very different ways, for example, than the artists of the 1970s did. So, I mean, when you see that without necessarily an announcement about it, but clearly, art of contemporary art is going to engage with its time. So I don't see it in the same sort of, I can't compare the two. I think, for example, there had been an Iraqi absence in some of the biennials, as opposed to, except for the diaspora Iraqi artists. So there are different levels of complications that makes the answer of this question, almost impossible because of the different realities of the time. So I don't know that I can, I mean, the reaction to Naksa was a very strong from the state to the people. It was mandated in various ways. I mean, it's something I remember growing up in school and, having to collect food for Palestine, for example, as in elementary school. So it's a very different thing than what had happened, with the Iraq war and the complication of a global existence.
Okay.
I don't know if that answers it, but that's all I have.
Okay. Well, I think that if that's your answer, that's your answer. So I think it's we're at time now, and it's been an amazing. Even though I think we were missing two of our speakers. I think we had more than enough to talk about, and it's amazing to be able to have that kind of the luxury of time to be able to really discuss more in depth with both of you. And I learned so much. And I think that, judging from the audience reactions, they did too. And so thank you so much, Nada and Kudzya, for sharing your time and your knowledge and your experience so generously with us here and at the March meeting. And thank you everyone in the audience for joining us. And I guess we'll see you soon.
Thank you,
Okay.
John, for
Thank you.
Thank
the
you.
moderation. And Qudsia, very nice to hear your presentation. Pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Nada, it was wonderful to actually hear you. It was very knowledgeable, and look forward to actually meeting you soon.
Yeah.
Inshallah.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
John.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.